7,000 emergency boxes. And that is a box of about 25 pounds of shelf-stable groceries that'll support a family of 4 for about 4 or 5 days. These boxes make it easier for our partners to distribute food in a socially distanced way. And that was another big piece of the COVID impact was here at the food bank. We typically would have our partners come and pick up food. They'd order it online, we'd set it up for them, and they'd come pick it up and take it back and distribute it. When COVID hit, we stopped all people coming to the food bank to protect not only our partners and our clients, but also our staff. And so we now just deliver all that food to our partners versus them coming to pick it up. That put our warehouse operations into overdrive. We increased warehouse staff. We increased warehouse capabilities and capacity. We now have 4 warehouses versus 2 in order to store and distribute all the food we're having to put out into the community. In a normal year, we would distribute about 32 million meals. This year with COVID, we're looking at well over 50 million meals, probably a good 50 to 70% increase than what we would have done last year. The other thing that's really significant is the number of unemployment claims in the area. The latest data shows that that's increased well over 123%. And I think that's the biggest impact for our clients that's significant and that's pushing these very newly food insecure people into our world is the loss of jobs. We don't see this as a sprint. This is a marathon. So even though we're starting to see vaccines coming into the system, and I know that eventually COVID will take a back door to all of the other news out there, these food insecure and the newly food insecure, it'll be years before the economy of this region catches up and job security is back. So we know that we're going to be having to feed these 600,000 plus people for at least another 2 or 3 to 4 years. So we look at this as a marathon. We're projecting how we're going to continue to feed everyone, how we can continue to make sure we have enough food to feed all these people as well. Your support, especially at this time of year where we'd never want to see any family without food on the table, is so very, very important. When I talk about 600,000 people, it's really hard to imagine that in the DC area where we live in one of the most wealthy areas of the country. The other sad part of that is about a third of those are kids. And we really can't afford for our children to go unfed. It affects their health. It affects their ability to learn. It affects their ability to become productive members of the community. So again, every bit that you donate, that you support with the food bank is so important to help make sure that we have everyone fed. I want to add one last thing. We still need volunteers. We do have to pack these 250,000 boxes of food. So if you are so inclined over the holidays and you want to come and volunteer at the food bank, we would love to have you. We do provide social distancing. We have temperature checks. We make sure everyone wears a mask, you wear gloves. We're very protective of our volunteers. But it's a wonderful way to give back to the community during the holidays into January, February, and March. We take 7 days a week, 2 to 3 shifts a day of volunteers. So if that is something you would love to do, we would love to have you come see us. You can contact me directly. I'm happy to hook you up with a slot to volunteer. And again, if you ever have any questions about what we do at the food bank, I'd be happy to answer all of that. I'm giving you a very brief overview just so you get a sense of the impact of COVID. But we still, our main goal will always be to make sure that everyone has good, healthy food on the table every day. So I really appreciate you giving me the time to speak today. Thank you so very much. And I'm going to turn this over to Casey.
Thanks, Mary Beth. What an awesome cause and an awesome program. We're excited to bring you a very robust agenda today in light of the and support of the food bank. The charity event that we're talking about today is the future of government cybersecurity, cyber warfare, the supply chain, and CMMC's new role. We've got an expert panel of panelists, over 200 years of cybersecurity experience, which I think is amazing. So you've got key experts in each domain that you'll be hearing from today over the next 90 minutes in total time. So we're really going to frame for you where we've been, where we're going in 2021 and beyond. And I think we all know, those of us that are in cybersecurity, we have to understand that we don't want to start 2021 the same way we started 2017, 2018, 2019, and just do another Groundhog Day. So we're going to give you some compelling information today. We're going to start at the top. We'll drill it down and pull things together for you. Cybersecurity really is an enabler of a much bigger picture, which is called unrestricted hybrid warfare. It also goes under the name of asymmetric warfare. And the other issue I want to bring up to the audience is that we in cybersecurity have tunnel vision on technology and overconfidence on technology. Now, technology is absolutely critical, but we have to understand the big picture, the human element, and then technologies fit inside of that. But buying technology is not the be all and the end all, and we've learned that the hard way over the past, say, many years, and specifically the last few years. So the summary that I'll give you ahead of time is that success and survival requires uniting risk, strategy, the human factor, technology, and security. And that's how companies are going to be successful going forward. And we're going to give you that information today. At the very least, you'll be the most, what is that, the old commercial, the most interesting person. You will be the most interesting person. You will be armed to go back to your companies and be the cutting edge back into your companies with this information. So some of the glossary that we'll talk about today is the gray zone, asymmetric hybrid warfare. If you have not read the book, The Art of War by Sun Tzu, I would recommend you buy the book. It's a short read and read it once a year and keep it on your desk. Again, The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Unrestricted warfare basically refers to no rules. Our adversaries follow absolutely zero rules. And in the United States, we're conditioned to think and to know that we're a nation of laws. Our adversaries are absolutely not, and actually use our nation of laws to hold us accountable and handcuff us. There is a 1999 book. It's actually available on the internet if you want to search for it. It's called Unrestricted Warfare, and it was written in 1999 by two Chinese colonels out of the PLA. That also gives you an informational background of what's going on regarding unrestricted hybrid warfare. So our panel of experts, again, are over 200 collective years of cybersecurity experience. We've got Kris Nissen joining us today, the head of asymmetric threat supply chain strategy with the MITRE Corporation. Mark Montgomery, the executive director of Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Kristen Lovejoy, the global head of cybersecurity for Ernst & Young. Ed Bassett, chief information security officer with NeoSystems. Harvey Rishikov, Director of Policy and Security Research with the Applied Research Laboratory for Intelligence and Security. Now that's a mouthful. And then Ed Crusius, who's a partner with Holland & Knight, a significant law firm that deals with a tremendous amount of cybersecurity and insider threat. But in our next step, before we get started, I'd like to go around the country, actually, because this is a video call, and go around to each one of our folks, starting with Kris Nissen. Give us a 1-minute background on introduction on who you are and your background, please. Kris Nissen. Need you off of mute, Kris.
I think Kris is muted.
Okay, let's go to Mr. Mark Montgomery.
Thanks. Hi, it's Mark here. As you mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. We were a congressionally mandated commission that, after a 1-year review, put out a report this past March with a significant number of legislative and policy recommendations to correct some of our cybersecurity challenges and try to establish an effective cybersecurity strategy to defend our national critical infrastructure and cyberspace. And we have about 27 provisions executing 25 of our recommendations in the current National Defense Authorization Act. Finally, I'm also a fellow at the senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, who help support the CSC. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Kristen Lovejoy with Ernst & Young.
Thank you so much. I'm Kris Lovejoy. I'm the Global Head of Cybersecurity for EY. EY is a security practice of about 7,000 practitioners operating in 150 countries today, and working with mid to very, very large size organizations across a range of industries. And from a background perspective, been in security now going on almost 30 years. Spent most of my time, in the trenches as a practitioner, most of those years as the CISO for IBM, and really looking forward to the panel.
Thanks, Kris. Ed Bassett.
Hi, thanks. Ed Bassett. So currently CISO for NeoSystems. NeoSystems is a managed security service provider with a big focus, strong focus on the government contractor community. So really focused on CMMC and some of the other emerging regulations around cybersecurity coming from the government. My background is designing, building, operating security programs for companies as a consultant, as a managed service provider. So like Kris, in the trenches, very pragmatic view on how these threats tend to manifest and how we defend and react to those threats.
Thanks, Ed. Harvey Rishikov. Harvey, you're on mute. We'll go to Ed Crusius.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Appreciate being on this panel. My name is Eric Crusius. I'm a partner at the law firm of Holland and Knight. I've been practicing for about 20 years and focusing on helping government contractors through compliance issues, most significantly through the compliance issues that come up with cybersecurity, but also just the day-to-day tasks of blocking and tackling on cyber awareness and understanding the threats and how to meet those threats. Thanks.
Thanks, Ed. Chris Niston.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here again. I've got a background in engineering, but I've spent 32 years at the MITRE Corporation, almost all of that in national intelligence. And with Harvey, I was the co-author and the principal author on a report that we recently published called Deliver Uncompromised, actually in 2018. You can just Google that. And it kind of laid the groundwork for everything that you're seeing happening now when we recognize that we're in a new era, which I'll talk a little bit about. MITRE is a nonprofit. We work in the nation's interest.
Thanks, Kris. And Harvey Rishikov.
Right. So thank you, guys. I'm just a simple attorney, but when you said 200 years of experience, I'm feeling a bit old. But I first encountered this issue when I was with the FBI, when we had a penetration at the Department of Defense in the mid-90s under the Clinton administration. And that's when we began to focus, at least my career, on why this is going to be an existential threat for our networks. And then I got involved with the counterintelligence group of NCIX, working on more of these cyber-related issues under the Obama administration. And then most recently, the mouthful is ARLIS is a UARC, University Affiliated Research Center. So we have specific contracts with DoD, and we have a 128,000 square foot SCIF that we are able to do work in. So that's how we're kind of attacking the problem currently. And I guess I ended with, I'm the former dean of the National War College, where we first started encountering this concept of the gray space that this panel is going to explore. Over.
Thank you very much. Yours truly, Casey Fleming. My background's IBM. I founded IBM Cyber Division before they called it the Cyber Division. And I've been in cybersecurity ever since. And currently I head up a company focused on strategic risk intelligence and modeling, which is Black Ops Partners. So we'll get started, folks. As I mentioned, we'll take you through the high level, the big picture, where cybersecurity fits into it. You'll see that it's not just technology, it's the whole gamut of 360 degree. And I'd like to start with Mark. And if you would, please tell us about the gray zone and why we share. And if we can go to slide number 1 on the gray zone, please.
Hey, thanks, Casey. When the commission began to study this, our real question was, the question Senator McCain put to us in formulating it was, why is deterrence not functioning throughout all of cyberspace? In other words, we kind of thought, having good kinetic and non-kinetic tools was preventing like a significant nation state attack using cyber tools. And I think that's still true. But clearly, a whole bunch of bad stuff was happening below the use of force, kind of in the gray zone, that area where an adversary's actions may not necessarily prompt a U.S. reaction. Outside the cyber world, you've seen this in the South China Sea with how the Chinese kind of insidiously, slowly built up non-maritime features into their man-made islands, and then eventually militarized them, despite telling the Obama administration for over 2 or 3 years they wouldn't do that. They eventually did it. You can see it to some degree in Russia and Crimea. I mean, eventually they did pay a price for their economic sanctions, but certainly not one that deterred their overall objective of grabbing Crimea from Ukraine. In cyber, you see it in all kinds of areas. The Chinese kind of the intellectual property theft that has occurred over 2 decades. There's a commission on intellectual property theft that Admiral Dennis Blair ran that has updated itself 2 or 3 times and showed nearly $1 trillion in unrealized U.S. GDP growth from that intellectual property theft. The plurality, even a majority, from China. The theft of the OPM data. The North Korean attack on Sony, or Iranian denial of service attacks on our banks earlier in the decade. All these were actions below which the United States determined that they would not, prompt a U.S. an overt, at least U.S. reaction. So that this gray zone area was a significant issue and challenge for us. And I think from the Commission's point of view, there was a lot that needed to get done. And certainly we focused a lot on building a better deterrence by denial, or a better defensive system. How do you defend your critical infrastructure better? How do you build a better public-private collaboration to do that? And that's broadly, that's a little bit outside the gray zone, but those were 2 very strong principled two strong principles that kind of weave through all our efforts. But then the third principle really is about the gray zone, and it's about how do we defend, how do we operate more effectively in that gray zone? And we advocated for a defend forward policy, an idea that you, using all the elements of power, not just the military, using your economic, sanctions, law enforcement, diplomatic activities, and the military, how do you operate forward to create the conditions where the adversary does not want to take those actions that were traditionally below the use of force or in the gray zone? And so we advocated developing those tools. Clearly, in the cyber realm, that's really about U.S. Cyber Command's persistent engagement strategy. The idea that we're out there probing the adversary systems, looking for the tools they're using, trying to determine what targets they're going after so we can have a better defense, but also potentially installing malware so that we can have our own offensive capabilities, or maybe just causing friction in their systems. So they're raising the cost of action for the adversary. So that's how the Commission looked at the gray zone. It was a real problem for us. There's a lot we have to do. Certainly we have to build a better defense to kind of just be better against actions that happen in the gray zone if we didn't take a response, and then developing defend forward so that we are more active in the defense of our in the operations in that below the use of force in the gray zone.
Great, thank you. So really the gray zone, in summary, is that area between peace and war that our adversaries are operating in. And as you mentioned, there are, if you just go through the news, you can see all these examples of gray zone tactics that are being used by our adversaries. So thank you for the description of the gray zone. So one of the strategies, the key strategy in the gray zone is called unrestricted hybrid warfare. It's also known as asymmetric warfare because it's coming from all different angles. I'd like to ask Kris, what are some of the dimensions of asymmetric threat beyond cyber, where cyber is a piece of asymmetric threat, but really only one of over 100 different methods? Now, our adversaries know they don't want to come at us from a military perspective, especially not a nuclear perspective. So that's why they're operating in this gray zone. and attacking with the strategy of asymmetric hybrid warfare. Unfortunately, it's focused on our companies, our universities, our government agencies, and so on. So over to you, Kris, on what are some of the dimensions of asymmetric threat beyond cyber, and then we'll go into slide number 2 for a graphic on that.
Okay, sure, great. Yeah, I'm going to expand on what Mark, did a fantastic job of laying out there. And this is a slide that I put together about 4 years ago for our board of directors at the time. And it was trying to think about what is the third offset, where the Pentagon was saying it was going to be technology. We were looking at and saying, no, that doesn't make sense because there's not a technological edge at scale. And it's really kind of recognizing that we're in a new era. And I call it the asymmetric era. You could call it, a whole different number of things. But we really, since the Cold War, we went from a nuclear era underscored by nuclear deterrence, a conventional era underscored by conventional deterrence, the ability to fight 2.1 wars, I think it was, on different continents. But the problem is, toward the end of that, roughly in the late 80s, very early 90s, China and Russia were both saying, we really don't want to take the United States on kinetically. We will if we have to, but they actually use the word asymmetric. We would rather fight them asymmetrically or anti-symmetrically, I think is how China said it. And the way we define that is there's really 4 ways to fight: win by fighting, win by not fighting, win by not losing, and win by disrupting. So if you think of it that way, the islands in the South China Sea is a win by not fighting, right? They take over the islands, and now it's a big deal if we, float a DDG class warship through the area, which should be navigable waters for everybody. Win by not losing is more like guerrilla warfare. What the asymmetric era is really all about is win by disrupting. And we further break that down in the technical realm. Now there's bigger things than that, as you've alluded, elections and economics and things like that. In the technical realm, which is what this discussion's about with cyber, there's really 3 main reasons why they're getting in there, and they are foreign intelligence services, the big 7 nation state adversaries that we face today. And that is to steal IP, to build intelligence collection, and to make a mission failure, make a system not do what it's supposed to do when it needs to do it. So it's moving in and out of these 3 things that is the primary purpose of probably 90% of the technical operations. I would say that I'll get into it a little further. When you say the realms beyond cyber, I view this, and we talk about this in Deliver on Compromise, as it really is. I call it supply chain, but there's really 4 main attack vectors for technical operation. Cyber IT systems, cyber OT systems, those systems with real-time deadlines, whether it's a factory, whether it's a jet, electric grid, things where the deadline has to be met. The human element, witting or unwitting, and the formal supply chain, software, hardware, services, products, drugs. It can be anything in that realm. So we wrap a big circle around that and say that in intelligence parlance, that's called a blended operation, because they rarely attack only in one. They move in and out of them as a function of strategic intent and access. So, just what you read in the open source about the attack on the centrifuges in Iran is a good example of that. Supposedly, an individual walked in, witting or unwitting, with a thumb drive, plugs it into the PLC, programmable logic control layer of a system that's running a cyber OT system, and it messed with the centrifuges for close to a decade. So it's really the human domain. It's a cyber OT domain. You could also say, if that person might have been a contractor, it was a supply chain. It was a contractor as a part of the supply chain. What it wasn't was a cyber IT attack. Now that might have taken place earlier, getting the software loaded onto that thumb drive, especially if it was an unwitting insertion. So we think of it holistically, because the problem that we're facing is not only did our adversaries get, a 20, 25, 30 year jump start on us before we started thinking this way, but we don't have we don't have strategic deterrence to this. And when I wrote that slide, nobody was even talking about it. Now, I think there's a whole lot of recognition that we are, in some of it we can't talk about here, we are definitely on a path to what I call the North Star and building that strategic deterrence. And the Solarium Commission and others, and certainly the Congress has taken great strides in those areas.
Thanks, Kris and Mark. Both of you did a great job outlining really the big picture of what's going on and how we get down into cybersecurity. Harvey, I'd like to go over to you just for some of your comments regarding the hack this week on FireEye and some of the current off-the-shelf hacks and so on, and how do they play in to what Kris and Mark just said?
Right. So what I would say is that we have moved from we call it from the ward room to the boardroom. Where we're experiencing these issues of what the attack surface is in the gray space is the commercial and private sectors. And as alluded to by Kris and to Mark, this is below the threshold of what we under the law of armed conflict. And the big issue that I think both this administration and the administration before struggled with is what is an appropriate response when the targets are actually the private sector and the commercial space. And this recent attack that we're seeing with SolarWinds is a classic example of collection, and then the ability to have mission disruption based on that information. And as the slides say that you have, what are the rules? Only we call this the classic tension between Title 10, military operations, Title 50, intelligent operations. This appears to be, quote, Title 50. They are network penetrations, but are there actually network attacks? So we're caught up in the West of trying to distinguish between an attack versus a penetration, Title 50 versus Title 10. And I'm a lawyer, and we employ a lot of lawyers about whether or not the action is appropriate. As Mark has said, in the issue of the new cybersecurity issue of Defend Forward is for us to be on people's networks, sitting outside networks. So I would say this is, Casey, the challenge for our generation going forward, is that the old paradigms that we use are just not sufficient for us to deter our adversaries from doing what they want to do with us. But the issue here is the cyberspace encompasses so many aspects and elements. If we start doing things, we have an escalation ladder that we do not share with our adversaries. And the concern is, would we start a major cyber and kinetic response depending on what we do in order to defend ourselves? We don't have a grammar the way we did in the Cold War and how we avoided a nuclear exchange. We are still kind of pawing our way through for the appropriate language and communications with our adversaries, so that when we signal that we're not happy that X has happened, what is the appropriate response? And there's a big difference in our world between taking down Sony and messing with centrifuges that tie to our nuclear capacity. The hypothetical I give people, what would be our response if an adversary started playing with our nuclear comms or nuclear triggers and penetrating them in a cyberspace? I think that would be considered a potential act of war. And then the question is, under the law of armed conflict, what is an appropriate response? The other irony is that economic security has become critical, because we all know that the competition turns on innovation. That's what makes people competitive. And now, to quote our friend Comrade Putin, whoever controls AI will control the world. So just think of this, the AI competition, very similar to the nuclear race that we had with missiles. This may be the next arena of competition. And of course, AI is so much controlled by the private sector. guys like what used to be in IBM, Google, and the rest of the private sector. So that's why this is such a significant, important issue. And I'm great that the panel sort of laid it out with Mark and Kris's area. But as I'll end it with, what I say to CEOs and when I say to the C-suites and the boardrooms, guys, you're the front lines. You actually, it's not the Maginot Line anymore. It's not what you have for your IP is what's going to be critical in the economic competition we're having with our peers. I'll end with that to scare everyone.
Well, thank you very much, Harvey. That is excellent, an excellent synopsis. But, you know, people say that where we are today with our companies, our private sector, and our universities and our government agencies, it's kind of what we're facing, what we faced back in World War II, when you see the rise of the Nazi regime and so on. And they ask me frequently, and they probably ask you guys as well, you know, do you really think that this is World War III? And my answer back is, what do you think World War III looks like? So anyway, thank you for that, Harvey. I think I kind of helped scare the audience as well on that. So I'd like to go over to Kristen. Kristen heads up cybersecurity, as you heard, for EY. And Kristen, you're seeing at the customer level, what are clients seeing? And on a scale of 1 to 10, where is U.S. cybersecurity today in readiness and capability? And in your opinion, what do you think companies must do in 2021 and forward differently?
Thanks, Casey. Okay, let me tease this out a little bit. So let's just start from a U.S. perspective. And I think, you know, there's, you know, from a scale of 1 to 10, that's not an easy question, because when you ask the question, you're really asking across a number of parameters. So when I'm thinking about it from the perspective of the U.S. versus other nation states when it comes to a legal framework for the management of cybersecurity risk, the technological capabilities that we have available to us, the organizational constructs that we have in place, our ability to capacity build internally, and the mechanisms that we have for cooperation internationally. And all of these aspects are incredibly important when you're trying to weigh the overall health and capacity of a nation state in addressing these issues. And I think that when it comes to the U.S., I mean, there's some things that we do really well, and there's others that we don't. And some of those are changing. So if you look at the legal frameworks in which we have in place, I think that, you know, the U.S. is very balkanized in its approach. You know, when we think about cybersecurity, oftentimes the cybersecurity and privacy dictates that we have in place are very sectoral in nature. Those sectoral dictates often will conflict with one another. And that is problematic for many organizations who are operating in the States, because they don't know with what they're supposed to be complying at any given time. And so sometimes the result is they just ignore it. You know, from a technological perspective, yes, we are very advanced. We have a lot of technologies available to us. That's a very good thing. I think from an organizational perspective, our organization, particularly on the national government side, is kind of reflective of that balkanization. At least my humble opinion is we have far too many organizations. I'm not really sure in any given situation who are you supposed to call. There's lots of telephone numbers. It's not always clear to me who's on top. From a capacity building perspective, I think we're doing a better job than we have in the past, though there are certain nation states like Israel who are doing much better job. International cooperation is something that I've seen over the past few years has not been something we've been particularly good at. I'm hoping over time it's a set of muscles that we can begin to reflect. In any case, I think that, you know, in the U.S., we have some positives like our technology. We have some negatives like our legal frameworks that are emerging, but are balkanized. We have, you know, other things like capacity building that are definitely improving. So, you know, where would I like to, you know, in which country would I like to live from a cybersecurity perspective as an enterprise? U.S. is probably up there at the top 10, though arguably you've got the UK maybe a little bit farther along. You've got Singapore, Estonia, Lithuania, you know, even places like Norway and arguably Canada that have some benefits that, you know, we may not be able to enjoy. So I say, long story short, we're doing okay. There's opportunities for us to improve. It's going to take some time for us to get there, but it's going to take everybody else time as well. What I would say as an institution operating within the U.S., one of our biggest challenges of any given enterprise is that, and I appreciate how important the subject is, but boards of directors and CEOs, they don't use war language when they're talking about cyber risk. They don't think about it that way. And, one of the challenges is because it is such a big, scary problem that seems to be something that doesn't affect them. What happens is cybersecurity gets relegated down into the basement of a few, very smart people that understand the language. And essentially what they're told is that, if you comply, we're okay. So we need to stop kind of thinking and talking about cyber the way we are and find some way of enabling a language that allows businesses to think about cyber within a risk-oriented business and risk-oriented framework construct, so that they can understand what they really need to worry about and they have an opportunity to actually work on those things, not relying on frameworks and standards that are kind of after the fact, but really thinking about business risk and cyber risk from an, building it inside perspective. In any case, my challenge to the organizations out there that are listening to this is, cyber, it's like dealing with any kind of disease. Think about today's analogy. It's a good analogy. And the world around us is getting a lot scarier, a lot more bacteria, a lot more viruses. We've got to figure out a way of keeping these things out. That's a business risk decision, how much you're going to protect yourself. And so we need organizations to begin to think in that kind of logical way so that they can address the risks that haven't yet manifested themselves.
Excellent, Kris. Thank you. It's true. Boards and CEOs really don't speak in cyber language. They treat it very tactically in the organization, when cyber and this whole asymmetric unrestricted warfare is a strategic issue. So boards and CEOs really only speak in terms of risk, revenue and risk. That's all they want to talk about. So it's got to be presented in a risk format when you're speaking to boards and CEOs. I'd like to go over to Ed and move into the CMMC, Cybersecurity Model Certification. We do need technology. We do need models, procedures, and practices. What are companies in the defense industrial base doing in response to the cyber warfare threat?
Yeah, thanks, Casey. I mean, Kristen gave us kind of a global view, and I'll kind of dive, into the defense industrial base specifically. I mean, this is 300,000 companies that support the Department of Defense, so it's a pretty good-sized supply chain, and a lot of difference in terms of what people have done, so far, right? I would say that, in 2020, we've seen a really significant uptick in the amount of executive level attention. So you mentioned, the CEOs are on the front line. I don't know that they feel like they're on the front line, to be honest. I mean, there's a war going on that maybe they're not willing participants in, or even really understanding what that war is about. So I think that their behavior, the executive level attention, is really been driven by government policy saying, you have to comply, you have to do these things. So it is very, very compliance driven, to some of Kris's comments. And I think, but if you look at the work that Mark Montgomery in the Solarium Commission and Kris did and Deliver Uncompromised, that highlighted that there's a need for some policy change. The DoD, in response to that, changed some of their acquisition policies to make expectations more clear to the defense industrial base. And so has that gotten folks' attention? It absolutely has gotten their attention. And I think, so you can look at it as compliance only, but that compliance requirement and setting the standard as far as what kind of cybersecurity those companies ought to be doing, has come from some good knowledge of the threat. So, we don't have CEOs knowing what the adversaries are up to. They don't even always know who the adversaries are, or what techniques they employ. But they're willing to respond in a way of, okay, if you're telling me I got to do my part and this is what my part is, then I'll do that. And there's a financial motivator there, obviously, right? That they don't qualify for government contracting if they don't do it. So the result of some of these new policies is that I've seen, this year, a lot of fixes to longstanding issues are being implemented across a pretty good percentage of the defense industrial base. So the larger, more sophisticated elements of the defense industrial base obviously have been taking this seriously for quite some time, but a lot of small and mid-sized companies, it hasn't been in the boardroom, it hasn't been in the executive suite until now, but now it is, and I think there's a lot of things happening. IT modernization, cloud adoption, hiring of managed service providers that specialize in security, adding formal security programs where none existed before, some technology things like multi-factor authentication, advanced anti-malware. So there's a whole bunch of those things. I would say that the adoption percentage is much higher now than it was a year ago, and will be much higher, in 5 years when we finish the rollout of CMMC. So yes, it's changing behavior for sure.
That's good and great on that. The U.S. cybersecurity, U.S. counterintelligence strategy that came out in February for the next 2 years through 2022. One of the key tenets was that the U.S. government said, listen, we can't do this alone. The private sector must get involved and help themselves and get serious and help themselves. It's one of their 5 tenets. So very good point, Ed. Thank you for that. I'd like to go over to Eric. You're an attorney you're a partner for Holland and Knight. What are you seeing now with insider risk as an example or a vector, or really what you want to tell the audience regarding the legal side, insider risk, that type of thing?
Sure, and thanks. I want to just pick up really quickly on one thing that Ed said about the small, medium-sized business compliance with or awareness of cyber risk. I think that comes in, there's 2 reasons for that. One is a lot of small businesses think that they'd never be a target, whether it be an insider or a nation state. I gave a cybersecurity presentation about 7 or 8 years ago, and a business owner with 2 employees came up to me and told me that his company was a target of a Chinese attack. And that was primarily because they had access to a large prime system. So I think, for the small, medium-sized businesses out there, you can, no matter how small you are, you may be on the radar of a nation state or an insider for that matter. And then the second, roadblock I think a lot of small, medium businesses think they have is that they just can't meet the challenge. And how is a business with 10, 20, 30 employees able to kind of push back on a sophisticated attack? And oftentimes the answer is alone that you can't, but there are things out there, there are solutions out there that can help you through those problems. So I just wanted to kind of pick up on Ed's point before we do that. Move on to insider risk. But, when dealing with clients, I think the biggest theme I'm seeing is they are prepared, they understand the risks from outside their organization, but they aren't prepared and don't understand the risks from inside their organization. And of course, there are 2 types of actors inside an organization that can pose a threat. The one is the benevolent actor who just doesn't have the proper training or the proper security controls aren't in place to prevent somebody from clicking on a link that they shouldn't or downloading a file that they shouldn't. And the second is, of course, the malevolent actor, the one who's really trying to destroy the company from the inside for whatever reason, for a grudge, for payment. They're motivated by a myriad of things. We couldn't even categorize all of them. So I think, kind of preparing for that insider risk is really important. And to Kristen's point earlier, it's not just the check the box scenario. It's really trying to think, for lack of a better term, think bigger about the threats that are out there and how to meet those responses. The regulations and, when a new regulation comes out, clients want to know, how do I comply with this regulation? And that's a really good question to ask. An even better question to ask is how do I make sure that I can anticipate threats in the future? And some of these regulations and the CMMC model are kind of designed to help contractors do that. If you comply with these requirements, the 110 controls in NIST 800-171, you'll be agile enough to kind of meet the threats that you don't even know about yet. But it has to be more than just a check the box scenario. So companies can kind of, even if they don't anticipate a threat, kind of meet that threat. And then we have of course, the added problem that we're in the middle of a global pandemic and all the terrible things that go along with that. One of the nicer things for some people is the ability to work at home. But then again, that poses an additional security risk. We had new regulations that came out in August of this year that ban the use of certain Chinese technologies by contractors, whether the technology was connected with the contracting part of the organization or not. And there isn't clarity on that as to whether that technology can essentially be count as home technology. So for instance, if you have a router in your house that is manufactured by one of these technology providers, we don't have clarity from DoD or the government, I should say, on that. So kind of as we roll these things out, thinking about not checking the box, but just thinking of the bigger picture, but also, of course, understanding that, you're part of the solution too. And there are solutions out there that will enable companies to kind of understand and meet those threats, even if they're not so large.
Okay, outstanding. I'd like to go over to Harvey. Your points made, Eric, regarding the insider risk piece of it. Harvey, can you tell us about insider threat and why has it evolved into this term insider risk, and why is that important? Right,
it's a great question. And the reason is, when we first had the penetrations of Manning and subsequently Snowden, the theory of insider threat was much more focused on what we saw as an espionage-related concept. But when we started working with the DIB, what they began to say to us was, you know what, guys, we're not only worried about espionage, we're also worried about when an individual is upset, comes in with his or her 38 and starts shooting up our workplace. And as you know, unfortunately in America, we've had a series of workplace-related incidents that proved to significant fatalities. So they said, we're sort of much more interested in thinking through this risk problem as opposed to a threat. And what are the social psychology indicators that are there that may present us as be able to, what we say, to get left of the incident as opposed to right of the incident, dealing with its consequences. So we're at Arliss are really putting forward the concept of risk. And the second part I will answer is, for many of the major complex institutions, and many people on this call are very familiar with this, we know when you have a toxic manager, and that toxic manager hurts that entire department. And you also know when you have a superb manager, like a Kris Nissen or a individual like our friend who's moderating this panel, Casey, that when they're able to bring the whole department up. So one of the things we're working with them is, how do you early identify a toxic manager versus an excellent manager? Now, we used to do that with the 360 reviews, but they're necessary but not sufficient. So that's why we're expanding this concept of risk as opposed to threat, because threat is usually concerned with historically the Title 50 espionage, whereas risk we think is a broader term that the C-suite understands, and the variety of elements that we need to have to help monitor our workforces so that we are not surprised with activity that will be quite detrimental to the company. Hence the switch from threat to risk.
Thanks, Harvey. Eric was speaking about insider risk and technology that's been weaponized by the Chinese Communist Party. So, Kris, can you tell us, Kris Nissen, can you tell us more about the weaponization of technology and how it enables the asymmetric threat, and why this cyber Cold War is a misnomer? Parentheses, companies like TCL, Huawei, ZTE, Lenovo, Zoom, TikTok, on and on and on.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah. So, if you look at the major nation state adversaries that the West has, I should say, they each have a different strategic intent, a different operating tempo, a different approach. And that's certainly true if you watch how they behave in the cyber world. You can see if it's a Russian actor, just the way they drop off payloads and that, versus a Chinese versus a North Korean. There's a couple things. One is, if you look at what's been in the open source, just with Kaspersky in Russia, it's an attitude of going at scale, right? They basically said, trust us to protect your data. Give us root access to your hard disk. And then they suck it up and have the virtual equivalent of Google search across, tens and hundreds of millions of hard disks. China is doing the same thing. A lot of people haven't noticed it, but this breaching of what's called the Overseas Key Information Database was in the press yesterday. And it's just stunning because we've suffered some major losses, right? The Marriott database to collect information on who's where, when, the OPM database, everybody with clearances, and the DoD. And that's a gold mine. It's got nothing to do with trying to, hurt your credit. It's got everything to do with compromising you or getting into you. So what had happened with this, what's called the Zhenhao data breach, actually happened some time ago. But the press, academics have been leaking, and China has weaponized, the CCP has weaponized big data collection in many times illegal and non-consensual way, to the point where they are literally tracking and targeting 2.4 million people, 20.7% of their entire database is against U.S. entities. We are the largest, and 650,000 organizations are being tracked. And what they're doing with it specifically is literally building military-grade intelligence data. They actually have the ability to track our warships on the surface and below the surface. Well, not so much below the surface, but know where our battleships are, know who's on it, know what their rosters are, collect in their LinkedIn data, collect in their social media data, and literally track their cell phones. It's mind-boggling, the weaponization. In that case, covering the whole spectrum of everything that we've started out talking about. Whether they want to nudge a company out of a business so that they can get in a supply chain, whether it's to literally be prepared and know where those ships are and what they're doing. The big data that we all see with Google and Facebook is literally a drop in the bucket compared to what they're doing. They're doing that and much, much, much more. So it's not at all a Cold War. I think it's very much a hot war. It's just a quiet war. Operations are being conducted continuously, 24/7 globally. And yet, like we've talked on this call, most CEOs, just don't really have an idea. I think the fact that this data, China was the victim, is going to be embarrassing to them. And it also gives great insight that hopefully we can use in some of the boardrooms. Certainly I will, with the companies that I'm consulting with, to help them build a strategy for deliver and compromise.
Excellent. Thanks, Kris. Kristen, I'm going to come over to you in a second. Elizabeth, can we go back to the title slide, please? Now, Kristen, what is, where Kris just took us with this weaponization of technology, what is techno-nationalism as the new Cold War, and what is it? What does it mean?
Sure. But before I do that, I just wanted to just comment a little bit on, sort of the subject of CEOs and boards and sort of how they're thinking about cyber, and I was just reflecting on the, sort of the discussion about how much data is being, collected and being used by adversaries. Here's the reality from a CISO's, a CEO or a board's perspective. So 30% of consumers out there, this is just in the world, 30% of consumers will give away their personally identifiable information if it means they can get a really good coupon. Period, end stop, right? That's just the way it works. Now, in that world, what CEOs know is that, okay, so there's 30% of people who just don't care about their data. Then there's the other, 60 to 70% who care. And I have to ask myself, if their data gets stolen, what's the financial penalty to me? What's the impact? What can happen? And so they're doing that sort of cost, the value exchange dynamic in their head about what's it going to cost to protect it. Do my consumers expect that I'm going to take their data and give them something of value for it? So all of that is sort of happening in real time. And I can tell you that, for most organizations, that fear that, okay, country X is going to get my data and is going to use it, it seems so far away and so intangible that they find it hard to act because they don't necessarily understand it. So I think, going back to a point I made earlier, is most organizations today, therefore, because they don't understand sort of the big picture, what the risk is, and this concept of war and, adversary, it's not resounding to them. It's not making them change their behaviors. That's why they focus on compliance as the way in which they're looking. This is the rule book. This is what I'm going to do because there's something that tells me there's a penalty if I don't do it. We've got to really think about how do we change that game. That's the most important. If we really want to make true progress in this arena, we got to figure that out. When it comes to techno-nationalism, this is very interesting, is that, most nation states today, and there's, I think, 54 of the largest, sort of from a GDP perspective, 54 of the top 60 countries are actively changing their cybersecurity compliance dictates today. So they're either overhauling them or introducing new dictates. So that means that there's going to be a whole lot more behavior. And a lot of that is because these nation states recognize that national security and technology innovation is so tied to the lifeblood and the sustainability of that country. Now, the challenge with a lot of these regs is because of populism, most nation states are now enacting rules that are very localized. So, I'm going to, if California is, and the US is coming up with a 72-hour law for disclosures, we're going to redefine disclosure to be 42 hours. So it's not 72, it's 42. Okay, I don't know where you came up with that number. And we're going to redefine access of data to view of data. And we're going to, so anyway, from a compliance perspective, there are all of these changes, these minutia changes that are happening in the field that are going to have broad impacts on our corporations, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that have to comply with these regulations. So, from a techno-nationalism perspective, it is just the manifestation of a popular will that cybersecurity and privacy are important, and it's taking place in lots of weird ways that we as corporations are going to have to deal with for, many years to come.
Excellent, Kris. Thank you. Time check right now. It's about 3 minutes after. And what I'd like to do with the last 30 minutes of our webcast is I'd like to go around the country. Each of our panel are really top experts in their domain. And I'd like to go through and ask them to give them about 3 minutes apiece to give us their lay of the land, their call of the world, and their call to action to the audience and to us as citizens. And then I'd like to open it up. So any audience members who have some burning questions, please shoot them over to us. We'll take a look at those and hopefully dedicate the last 10 minutes to strong questions coming from our audience. So with that, I'd like to go to give you 3 minutes going forward. We'll start with Mr. Bassett. Ed Bassett, Give us 3 minutes of what your domain is, what you'd like folks to know, and what's your call to action, please.
I guess I've got a call to action to the companies out there that are maybe in the positions of some of the things Kris was talking about. Don't wait around for security to get any simpler. I think I'll circle back on that in a minute, because I think there are some things that we in the community need to do to make it simpler. But I think if you're on the implementing end of this, don't wait for it to get easier and more clear, because it probably won't in the near term. Hire some specialists and start improving your security. And I'll say that as we work with a lot of companies where they're doing something new. It's something new that they haven't done in that way before. Every single one of them is more secure and more resilient against the kind of threats we're hearing as a result of their decision to move ahead with that kind of a project. So, the work does pay off. It pays off in terms of compliance. It pays off in terms of lower risk and resilience. It has benefits to your business that are sometimes hard to quantify, and I think that's one of the challenges here. But don't wait for it to get simpler, and don't wait for all the answers to become clear. Security is a journey, not a destination. And I guess to the community, to the cyber community, the technology vendors in particular, the service providers like my company and others, my challenge is that we need to be bringing what I'll call consumer-ready secure IT. So there's having vendors bake security in, having service providers wrap around those IT products, services that are turnkey and compliant. So really making it easy for business owners to be secure without having to go out and become cyber experts themselves. We don't expect small business owners to understand all about government contract law or accounting. They hire pros. Same in cyber, right? We want to make it so the marketplace is easy for people to buy those services and consume IT in a way that isn't dangerous, quite frankly.
Outstanding. Thank you, Ed. Eric, can you give us your 3-minute view of the world, what you want people to know, and your call to action to the audience?
Sure, thanks. To the small, medium-sized businesses out there, kind of off of what I said before, you're not too small or unimportant to matter. You have a huge role to play in cybersecurity compliance and ensuring that our nation is safe going forward from actors foreign and domestic. To every company out there, the government, if you want to sell to the government, they're going to emphasize security, your security posture, even if there aren't regulations that are out there. I'm seeing that in source selection decisions as well, where contracting officers and agencies are taking that on as an option, looking to see if what steps the contractor is taking to be cybersecurity compliant or take the risk-based approach to cybersecurity, and that could become a deciding factor in kind of the next big bid that's out there. So even if it's not an IT contract, so really there's a financial incentive to kind of look at your cybersecurity posture, and even if there aren't more boxes to check in a box to check scenario, to kind of look to see what you're doing to meet those threats. And the last thing I'd say is to the government folks who are implementing CMMC, which is a great start. Right now, the government is kind of working CMMC on the DoD side into contracts, really emphasizing kind of level 1, which is kind of basic cyber hygiene. What I'd really like to see them do is to kind of concentrate on level 3, which is contractors and companies that have controlled unclassified information that can harm us if it gets into the wrong hands. Really concentrate on level 3, get those level 3 companies on board before worrying about level 1 and 2. That's a risk-based approach that we should embrace, because level 3 is where we can really have harm onto our country and to our companies. So really to push level 3 as we go forward initially. Thanks.
Outstanding. Thank you, Eric. Mark, your takeaway, audience takeaway, call to action, 3 minutes.
Sure. So, look, I'm going to base mine on what's going on with the National Defense Authorization Act. Now, I'm going to assume that it passes either through the president signing it or setting it aside, or an override of his veto by the House and Senate. So that goes into effect. There are 27 provisions in there carrying out 25 of our recommendations, but there are 2 broad areas. So it's going to be critical that the Biden administration grab these and begin to work. And the first big area is reforming the government's ability to organize itself in cyberspace. This is about aggressively establishing the national cyber director position, creating a strategic leader who's doing the pre-planning before an event, building the relationships with the private sector before the event, leading the incident response at the beginning of the event, and then the long-term recovery. You know, there's, as been mentioned here, there's been a non-traditional national security emergency over the last 9 months, the COVID response. It was generally a failure in that pre-planning, building relationships, and initial incident response. The same thing will happen in cyber if we don't get this national cyber director up and running. So really get in there quickly, get the office associated with it up and running, get the staff there, get someone Senate confirmed rapidly. The Senate fought to have it Senate confirmed, so I know they'll do it rapidly. Get that going. But in addition to that, you have to strengthen CISA. CISA did well in the election security. I would note that election security is one of those infrastructures where you tend to be disconnected from the internet, but it's connected to the internet. So I'm not sure it's a meaningful tell of how we'll do in electrical power, telecom, and financial services going forward. But CISA needs to be empowered. It needs to have threat hunting on the .gov, something we put into the law that would have been helpful over the last 7 or 8 months while SolarWinds was going on inside our systems. But we got to strengthen CISA, and there's a bunch of recommendations in there, but grab them and move forward with them. We also need, and there's a whole second group, I'll go quickly on this and say, it's about building the public-private collaboration. I worked for the National Security Council in the late 1990s under Richard Clark, so probably had to deal with some of Harvey's inputs from FBI. But, you know, we laid out a way forward in PDD 63, their National Infrastructure Assurance Plan. 80% of that was not affected, not implemented. Many of the recommendations of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission are the same, particularly about building that public-private collaboration. And the reason is it's hard. It costs money. You have to affect how businesses think about cybersecurity. But we started with some basic literature in the NDAA about creating a joint cyber planning office, federal government working with state, local governments in the private sector to plan for campaigns, you know, to counter campaigns by China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, non-state actors, and also to do continuity of the economy planning about how you rapidly restore the economy after a cyber incident, recognizing you can't just use the FEMA model of bringing back hospitals and assisted living facilities first. You might actually have to prioritize, you know, bringing back, you know, servers that drive our major commodities exchanges and over the, you know, OTC and currency exchanges and things like that. In other words, what's the number one priority in a cyber incident may not be the same as the number one priority in a tornado or earthquake response. So kind of getting those public-private collaboration going, along with, like I said, the reorganizing federal government. If the Biden administration runs out and tackles those, I think they'll set themselves up for success over the next 4 years.
So we actually have a long list of questions that have come in. And by the way, that was a great summary. Can you re-emphasize? Here's a question. So I'd like you to take it, Mark. Do you think public and private collaboration help address the cyber risk holistically? Let me repeat that. Do you think public and private collaboration help address the cyber risk holistically?
Well, listen, if done effectively, yes. I mean, because let's see what's going on here right now is cyber risk is driven by two things. One, the availability of tools to more and more malicious actors and tools that are of greater capability, and that is increasing exponentially. The second impact is our interconnectivity. We're more and more interconnected between devices, between systems, between infrastructures. That's going up exponentially. So the two risk drivers in the private sector are going up exponentially. The risk mitigator, which is investment in cybersecurity, is at best linear on a slight upward glide slope. So most risk managers understand that if your two risk drivers are increasing exponentially and your risk mitigator is increasing linearly, you're in for a world of hurt. So the public-private collaboration is how you can close that gap rapidly by getting better information sharing, better response capability from the federal the federal government in building that. The government provides things in that public-private collaboration. It's not just about the government saying, "Here's the right level of cybersecurity for you to establish," although that is part of it. the government needs to be a willing partner, providing useful, actionable, unclassified threat information, warning information, and having some capability for incident response that isn't tied purely to cybercom and NSA, which are very hard to import over into the domestic environment, but having capable, useful hunt and incident response teams at CISA, for which really they're 1 or 2% of the capacity of cybercom right now. And that's just unacceptable in terms of capacity.
Excellent. Now, you're a government guy, and for the most part, a government guy. Let's go over to the private sector and ask Christian the same question. Christian, from your viewpoint, speaking with clients all day long, do you think public and private collaboration help address the cyber risk holistically?
I think it's critical. And one of the things I would say just in my close is that, don't be afraid in that communication to simplify the communication. So let me just take a step back. So as a private sector cyber person, the way we tend to think about cyber risk is that there's a threat out there, and that could be a person, it could be a group of people, it could be a piece of malware in the wild. It's going to try to exploit a vulnerability, which is a gap in somebody's knowledge, a gap, lack of a patch, a lack of an update, whatever the case may be, so that there can be an impact. And that could be stealing data, it could be disrupting the system, etc. So threat times vulnerability times impact equals cyber risk. The job of a practitioner is to mitigate the potential for the threat to get in, to mitigate the number of vulnerabilities that can be exploited, or potentially to deal with the impact. And so if you think about it that way, you think about it from almost like a bacteria or a virus model, there's lots and lots of stuff that's trying to get into our entities any given day. And our job is to try to mitigate the number of ways that they can get into our organization. Now, compliance requirements help you do the basics. It's like hand washing and all of those other good things we do. Those are the basics. But in order for us to really get an understanding of what's coming after us, what we need to worry about, that's where information sharing comes to play. So you need to reach out. You have to talk to the public sector sources, private sector sources. It's the information that helps you understand what are the controls that you need to implement in order to decrease the potential for that threat to get in, to decrease the number of vulnerabilities that can be exploited, or potentially to decrease the impact. And the other thing to keep in mind that in today's world, it's the small companies that are acting as sleeper agents, if you will, to get into the bigger organizations. So you are, just because you're a small organization, a couple of the panelists pointed out, you're still at risk. You're actually at more risk. And the reason is because they know coming after you, a small organization, is way easier than going after a big company, because the big companies have people, they have technology, they have ways of protecting themselves. So they're looking for ways inside by going through you. You don't want to be the organization that lets them in. So just, from it's a lot in a little package, but suffice to say, compliance, communication, risk awareness, these are all important characteristics for any given organization, no matter how big or small you are, to keep in mind in today's world.
Thank you, Kris. Excellent. Over to Kris Nissen, please. Kris, please give us your 3-minute summary of what you'd like people to know, what you're working on, what's most important, and more importantly, your call to action. But in the meantime, there's a question that came in that I'd like you to answer. What does the group think? This is to you, Kris. What does the group think about having a requirement for DID companies to have a board member designated or a security risk committee created to provide oversight to non-financial risks, which are security, cyber compliance, supply chain safety, et cetera? You want me to reread that?
No, I think I got it. Yeah, I would absolutely support that. Again, you want more carrots than sticks, but I think what my participation with Ed and NeoSystems and some of the panel discussions we've had, we're seeing a pivot where once you kind of lead them down the road of compliance with CMMC, one of our last calls a few weeks ago, some of the member companies are literally starting to say, what can we do beyond this? So I support that. I think it's, it's going to be part of my wrap up in that I've had two CEOs, two pretty good sized companies, they're tier 2 DIB companies, come to me after talks and found out that the CEO read the Deliver on Compromise and reorganized along those lines. They put the CISO under more holistic supply chain risk management. And for the whole purpose that they're starting to understand. So you asked what my takeaway would be. It depends who I'm talking to. To the private sector, whether you're DIB or not DIB, I would say, what is your unknown risk? And what is the cost of that risk in terms of your brand, in terms of your reputation, in terms of your stock price? I think that we are entering an era where, there was a time where you could not be in the C-suite and there was a time when you could be and not paying attention to cyber risks. Now that's kind of disappearing, even though we're kind of, CMMC had to drag part of the DIB in. I believe the same thing is going to happen with your other unknown risks. And it's going to come from your risk committee. It's going to come from your customers. It's going to come from your creditors. On the government side, I would say deterrence is the North Star. Let's keep our eye on that. What we're discussing here is stopping the bleeding, and that's a huge job. We're behind 20 years. So stopping the bleeding through the most used vector, the cyber IT side, is job number one. In the long run, we have to deter them from doing that. And I think Mark said something that, Harvey and I put in Deliver on Compromise. We got to start sharing our intelligence, consolidating it across the intelligence community. We asked for a national supply chain intelligence center to do strategic threat, strategic warning. The Congress is kind of playing with that. There's some hope that something like that might get stood up, and that would be a collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. And if you had such people, as was asked in the question, they would be a perfect representative for that.
Outstanding. I would like to comment also on this subject is that, we are all in the same fight, every one of us. Some of us are in the client side, private sector, university, government this, government that, but we're all in the same fight. And people in the way U.S. and the free world looks at it, it's all in competition, right? And you might be a competitor or that kind of thing. Well, we're not competitors when we're all in the same fight against a common enemy, which, as Kris mentioned early on, that there's about 7 of them. The top of that list is the Chinese Communist Party. There's only one China, and it's completely driven by the Chinese Communist Party. So when you're talking about China, you're talking about the CCP. And by the way, there are about 92 million members of the CCP, and they've infiltrated over 600 U.S. companies in the private sector, and as well as the government, universities, and so on. So I have not forgot about Mr. Harvey. It will be up to you next to give us your audience takeaway and your call to action, please, sir.
Thanks so much. So first of all, let me reinforce, I guess, the overarching part of my comments is we need to have greater illumination of the supply chain. And Mark has gone down a far way with his commission. I will just reference for you guys in the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, Section 1736, 1737, and 1739. And they're about the concept of creating sensors voluntarily, because we need to have a picture from the private sector of what the exfiltration is of data so that we're able to get an appropriate view of the entire ecosystem. As Kris noted, part of that issue is what our call to create a national intelligence center gathering the data that can then feed cybercom. And I would give to you the example of Israel. After this call, if you look at the bubble chart of how Israel, that believes it's constantly under cyber attack, they have completely fused public-private sector capability in a way that gives them huge advantage. I'd also look at our Five Eyes allies, how the Great Britain is trying to approach this problem. and how the Australians are trying to approach this problem. I would say getting that infrastructure a call to arms and having the private sector willing to share this information of the exfiltration is critical. As you said, we've been using the DFARS through CMMC, and the DFARS is a good example of how we're doing contractual relationships with the DIB, but it doesn't go far enough because it doesn't deal with the rest of our commercial enterprises. But I would say that's the next issue. We're trying to create a gold standard in using the DIB so that people would see that and demand that level of cybersecurity. Because at this point, offense beats defense. And what we're trying desperately is to increase our defense, of which deterrence and repercussions are important. And finally, I would sort of two last points, which is that though for Kris Lovejoy, I think, as you know, we have another area when you operate worldwide is the GDPR. The Europeans are taking a very different approach to privacy. Schrems 1 and Schrems 2 has had a dramatic impact on how we're going to be sharing data and whether or not that data is going to be appropriate. And we have a big international struggle for the Biden administration as which entity is going to get control of this private issue. I have one case in which they're arguing that even work done with consent for AI on a European platform, can you give those results to our laboratory, or will that be a violation of the GDPR, understanding what they think is for safe harbors? There's a huge international component part. And then finally, I would say we need, with the 5G experience, and the fact is you listed all of the Chinese suppliers and our attempt to try to exclude those suppliers, we do not have an industrial policy across the 5G and trusted countries, let's say Japan, where we have an industrial base that's going to have to compete on the 5G, XG communication networks. It's going to be another huge strategic problem. So my takeaway is more, I would say, work with the private sector to share their information with the government, getting the appropriate legal safe harbor rules in place, and for us to be able to say categorically that we're moving out and looking at the attempt to raise the costs for individuals who are willing to pursue this asymmetric war against us. Over.
Excellent, Harvey. Thank you very much. So to our audience, we promised to give you, or at least I promised to give you the tools that you need to forecast and plan for 2021 and beyond. I hope we've done that. Our panel of experts, as I mentioned, are the best of the best. The thing I want to leave back with you, is, as I mentioned when we started, was we will help you with the success and survival, which requires the unification of risk strategy, the human factor, technology, and security. I'd like to thank our panel for the time today, very much so. Again, I'm honored and privileged to work with this panel, and wish you guys and our audience the very best in holidays. And I'll turn this over to Elizabeth. Thank you very much.
Hey, Casey and Elizabeth.
Yes.
You know, I don't want to go out on a limb here. I have no idea how many questions there were, but I for one, would be willing, you know, if you consolidate them up, to send them along and try to address some of them. You know, hopefully there's not hundreds or anything, but.
Kris, we actually, I took the top questions and rolled them into each member's response. So we've completed the priority list of questions, and we've got another list of questions, but the priorities that came through, we answered those in your responses.
Fantastic.
And I want to also throw out another shout out to the Capital Area Food Bank. Please include them in your holiday plans.
Here. Great idea. Thank you guys for organizing this.
Yeah, thank you everyone so much for participating on this expert panel. I mean, I just am blown away every single time we have these conversations and learn something new. To the audience, please reach out and provide your feedback and let us know what other topics around cybersecurity and cyber warfare you'd like to discuss, as well as CMMC and other areas. we're delighted to bring these educational moments to you and want to also hear what your challenges are and how we can provide more information. So thank you so much for joining us. We're grateful for your attendance, and that concludes today's program. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yep. Bye-bye.
As we say, stay positive and test negative.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.